Picture this, a palatial estate so vast it required its own power plant, so opulent that Marie Antoinette's furniture graced its halls, so meticulously crafted that European artisans were shipped across the Atlantic just to carve its ceilings, and yet, barely 3 decades after its completion, it was systematically demolished, erased from the landscape as if it had never existed, leaving behind only photographs, whispered stories, and a handful of salvaged artifacts scattered across museums and private collections like the fragments of a shattered dream. This is Whitemarsh Hall, the 147-room monument to Gilded Age excess that Philadelphia's grand old man of Wall Street, Edward Townsend Stotesbury, built on 300 pristine acres of Pennsylvania countryside, a palace that once stood as America's answer to European aristocratic grandeur but ultimately became a cautionary tale about the fleeting nature of wealth, the brutal costs of maintaining an impossible dream, and the dark bargain struck between old money and the invisible armies of servants, craftsmen, and laborers who made such magnificence possible. What secrets did those 147 rooms hold? What price was paid, not in dollars alone, but in human dignity, wasted potential, and moral compromise, to sustain this glittering facade? And why, in a nation that supposedly worships wealth and success, was this architectural masterpiece condemned to oblivion, dynamited and bulldozed into rubble, its very existence deemed an embarrassment rather than a treasure? The story of Whitemarsh Hall is not merely about one mansion's rise and fall, it is a mirror held up to American ambition itself, reflecting both our most audacious dreams and our deepest hypocrisies, and to understand its dark truths, we must first understand the man who conjured it into being, a man whose own life trajectory embodied the promises and perils of American capitalism at its most unbridled, most ruthless, and most spectacularly doomed. Edward Townsend Stotesbury was born in 1849 into comfortable but unremarkable circumstances in Philadelphia, the son of a sugar refiner whose business failed when Edward was just 12 years old, forcing the boy to leave school and take a clerk's position at a local brokerage house for $3 a week, beginning a 70-year career in finance that would see him rise to become one of the wealthiest and most powerful bankers in American history, though his name never achieved the household recognition of a Morgan or a Rockefeller, precisely because Stotesbury preferred to operate in the shadows, the ultimate insider who brokered deals, consolidated railroads, financed steel empires, and sat on dozens of corporate boards, accumulating a fortune estimated at over $100 million by the 1920s. Somewhere between $1.50 and $2 billion in today's currency, yet remaining perpetually insecure about his social standing, forever the self-made man among the inherited aristocracy of the main line. His first marriage, to Frances Butcher, lasted over 3 decades and produced 3 children, a respectable union that anchored him in Philadelphia's solid upper-middle class, but it was his second marriage, at age 63, that would transform his life and ultimately lead to Whitemarsh Hall's creation, for in 1912, just a year after Frances's death, Stotesbury married Eva Roberts Cromwell, a woman 22 years his junior, a beauty who had already divorced one husband and buried another, a woman who possessed not just stunning looks but also ferocious social ambition, impeccable taste cultivated during years living in Europe, and an absolute conviction that wealth without display was wealth wasted. Eva had watched the great European nobility, had studied how they wielded art and architecture as weapons of social dominance, and she understood intuitively what her elderly banker husband did not, that in the brutal theater of American high society, where old Knickerbocker families still looked down their noses at self-made millionaires, where the proper bloodline mattered as much as the balance sheet, you needed more than money, you needed a stage, a setting so magnificent that it forced acceptance, commanded respect, and announced to the world that the Stotesburys had arrived, not as supplicants at the gates of society but as its new masters. Did Edward truly desire such a monument, or was he, in his advancing years, simply unable to resist the will of his beautiful, ambitious wife who had given him a second youth, who made him feel like a conquering emperor rather than an aging banker? The question haunted their contemporaries and continues to echo through the ruins of their dream. The land Edward Stotesbury acquired in 1916, even as World War I raged across Europe, was a stunning tract of rolling hills, mature forests, and pastoral meadows in Springfield Township, Montgomery County, just beyond the Philadelphia city limits but far enough removed to create an aristocratic buffer between the industrial grime of the city and the rarefied world of country estates. Positioned strategically along the main line, that golden corridor of wealth that followed the Pennsylvania Railroad westward from Philadelphia, where the Biddles, Cadwalladers, and other old families had their country seats, and where new money titans were desperately trying to buy their way into legitimacy. But the Stotesburys weren't interested in merely joining the conversation, they intended to dominate it, to build something so overwhelming in scale and splendor that it would render every other mainline estate a mere cottage by comparison, and so Edward commissioned the architectural firm of Horace Trumbauer, the most fashionable society architect in Philadelphia. A man who despite having only an 8th grade education had taught himself the language of Beaux-Arts classicism and French chateau design so thoroughly that he became the go-to architect for plutocrats who wanted European grandeur, having already designed Linwood Hall for Peter A. B. Widener and the Elms for Edward Julius Berwind. Trumbauer understood exactly what Eva Stotesbury wanted, not an American house, but a French palace, specifically inspired by the Château de Fontainebleau, that Renaissance masterpiece that had housed French kings and emperors for centuries, a building that whispered ancien regime in every arch and ornament, that proclaimed lineage and permanence. That suggested the Stotesburys weren't merely rich Americans but the rightful heirs to centuries of European aristocratic tradition, never mind that. Edward's own grandfather had been a merchant and his father a failed businessman. The architect's renderings, when unveiled, took Eva's breath away, a U-shaped Georgian Revival mansion built of pale limestone, its central block rising 3 stories and topped with a balustrade, flanked by symmetrical wings that stretched endlessly along the landscape, the whole composition framing a vast formal garden that would rival Versailles, with the main facade presenting a stately colonnade of paired Ionic columns, massive French doors opening onto stone terraces, and interiors designed to house the finest European art and furniture that money could buy, every room a jewel box of carved paneling, gilded moldings, crystal chandeliers, and marble mantelpieces, a building, in short, that would cost approximately $3 million to construct, plus another $3 million to furnish and landscape, figures that in 1916 dollars represented an almost incomprehensible expenditure, equivalent to perhaps $150 to $180 million today, for a house that the Stotesburys would occupy only a few months each year, since Eva also maintained a 37-bedroom cottage in Bar Harbor, Maine, a Palm Beach mansion called El Mirasol that was even larger than Whitemarsh, and a Philadelphia townhouse for winter entertaining. Construction of Whitemarsh Hall began in 1917 and would consume 4 years, requiring an army of workers, stonemasons, carpenters, plasterers, electricians, plumbers, glaziers, landscape architects, and hundreds of common laborers, whose names are lost to history, whose individual contributions went unrecorded except in contractor invoices and payroll ledgers, men who sweated through Pennsylvania summers and froze through brutal winters to raise this monument to someone else's vanity, many of them recent immigrants willing to work for wages that American-born tradesmen would have rejected, creating a brutal hierarchy even among the working class where Italian stonemasons might earn decent pay while Irish hod carriers made barely enough to feed their families, and beneath them all, the black laborers who did the heaviest, dirtiest work for the lowest compensation, their presence essential but their humanity invisible to the owners who would eventually inhabit the completed palace. The scale of the project was staggering. The main house alone covered 100,000 square feet, contained 147 rooms, and required the excavation of a full basement that was itself the size of several ordinary homes, where massive coal-fired boilers, it took 3 separate boiler systems to heat the structure, sat alongside electrical generators, water pumps, and refrigeration equipment. The mechanical guts of the palace hidden beneath ground, tended by engineers and firemen who worked 12-hour shifts to keep the systems running, who never saw the glittering parties above their heads but whose labor was absolutely essential to maintain the illusion of effortless grandeur. The construction site became a small city unto itself, with temporary workshops, material storage yards, and even temporary housing for some workers, while daily freight trains arrived with shipments of Indiana limestone for the exterior walls, rare marbles quarried in Italy and France for the interior floors and columns, mahogany and oak from Central and South America for the paneling, and countless crates containing light fixtures, hardware, art glass, and decorative elements sourced from Europe, For Eva Stotesbury would accept nothing but authentic European materials and craftsmanship, insisting that American products were simply too crude, too modern, too lacking in the patina of history that true aristocratic taste demanded. The gardens, designed by the renowned landscape architect Jacques Grieber, were equally ambitious, requiring the transplanting of hundreds of mature trees, some centuries old, hauled to the site on specialized wagons, the creation of geometric parterres in the French formal style, the installation of marble fountains and statuary imported from Italian estates, the construction of a massive greenhouse complex spanning 15,000 square feet to supply fresh flowers year-round, orchids, roses, lilies, and exotic tropical species, and the engineering of an elaborate irrigation system drawing from a purpose-built reservoir, because natural rainfall couldn't be trusted to maintain the perfect emerald lawns and precise hedgerows that Eva demanded, that fantasy of controlled nature that was itself a display of dominance, a declaration that even the weather would bend to Stotesbury will. When Whitemarsh Hall was finally completed in 1921, the world that greeted it had changed dramatically from the one in which it was conceived, for the First World War had shattered the old European aristocratic order, toppling dynasties, bankrupting noble families, and rendering the very concept of hereditary privilege suspect in the eyes of many, while in America, progressive reformers were agitating for labor rights, women had won the vote, and a growing chorus of voices questioned whether such massive private wealth was morally defensible in a democratic republic, but none of this seemed to penetrate the limestone walls of Whitemarsh, where Eva Stotesbury set about establishing her court as if the calendar had frozen somewhere in the Belle Epoque, inviting Philadelphia's old families, New York's social elite, European nobility on American tours, politicians, industrialists, and even, on rare, carefully orchestrated occasions, artists and intellectuals who could provide cultural legitimacy to what might otherwise be dismissed as mere ostentation. The entrance hall set the tone for everything that followed, a soaring two-story space paneled in French walnut, anchored by a magnificent marble staircase that split into twin ascending flights, illuminated by a massive crystal chandelier that had once hung in a Venetian palazzo, the walls adorned with 16th-century Flemish tapestries depicting mythological scenes. The floor laid in a geometric pattern of contrasting marbles so precise that it took craftsmen 6 months to install, and at the far end, a fireplace of carved Carrara marble so large a grown man could stand upright within it, topped by an overmantel featuring a painting attributed to a student of Titian, every element carefully chosen not just for beauty but for pedigree, for the ability to cite European aristocratic provenance, to claim by association a heritage that the Stotesburys could never claim by blood. Beyond the entrance hall lay a succession of increasingly opulent reception rooms, the Grand Salon, a 60-foot-long space with 22-foot ceilings, its walls covered in silk damask of a blue so particular that the dye was specially mixed in lion, furnished with Louis XV and Louis XVI pieces that Eva had acquired from impoverished French aristocrats selling their patrimony in the economic chaos of post-war Europe, the furniture arranged in precise conversation groupings that a social secretary documented with photographs so servants could restore the exact placement after each party. The library, its walls lined floor to ceiling with mahogany bookcases holding thousands of leather-bound volumes, many of them purchased by the yard from European book dealers and never read, selected purely for the aesthetic of their gilt spines and matching bindings, with a massive partner's desk at which Edward could pose for photographs pretending to conduct business, though he maintained actual offices in Philadelphia and rarely worked at home. The music room, featuring a full pipe organ built into the wall, its gold-leafed pipes visible behind ornamental grillwork, though neither Edward nor Eva played and the organ was used primarily to provide background ambience during dinner parties, operated by a professional organist hired for the evening who sat hidden in a small chamber behind the instrument. Another invisible labor producing the soundtrack of luxury, the dining room, a baronial space seating 60 at a single table, the walls hung with Gobelin tapestries, the table itself set with Sèvres porcelain, Baccarat crystal, and Georgian silver, a complete service for 100 guests that required a full-time silver butler just to maintain its polish. The meals served by a brigade of liveried footmen moving in choreographed precision under the supervision of an English butler imported specifically because Eva believed only the British truly understood formal Service, the food prepared by a French chef in kitchens located in the basement and transported to the dining room via dumbwaiters and service corridors designed to keep the servants invisible until the moment their hands placed a plate before a guest, then vanishing again as if by magic. But the ground floor public rooms, magnificent as they were, told only part of Whitemarsh's story, for the private quarters on the upper floors revealed even more about the Stotesbury's aspirations and anxieties, their bedrooms occupying separate but adjacent suites in the tradition of European nobility, Edward's decorated in a masculine English Georgian style with dark paneling and leather furniture. Eva's an elaborate fantasy of French Rococo with walls covered in hand-painted silk depicting pastoral scenes, her bed a massive reproduction of Marie Antoinette's at Versailles, the mattress and linens changed daily by a lady's maid whose sole responsibility was the care of Eva's personal chambers, the bathroom attached to Eva's suite a marvel of marble and gold-plated fixtures that included a sunken tub carved from a single block of pink Portuguese marble, heated towel racks, and a ceiling mirror, a detail that scandalized some visitors but which Eva defended as merely practical for checking one's hair, though the prurient interpretation was probably closer to her actual intent, for Eva Stotesbury, despite her aristocratic pretensions, possessed a frank, almost modern sensuality that occasionally shocked the more prudish elements of old Philadelphia society. The second floor also housed guest suites, each named for its predominant color scheme, the Blue Room, the Rose Room, the Gold Room, and each furnished as if it were a standalone luxury hotel suite, with private baths, sitting areas, and writing desks stocked with Whitemarsh monogrammed stationery, for Eva understood that in the game of social dominance, every detail mattered. Every touchpoint was an opportunity to demonstrate superior taste and unlimited resources, to make guests feel simultaneously pampered and humbled, grateful for the hospitality but acutely aware of the vast gap between their own circumstances and the Stotesbury fortune. The third floor, less grand but still comfortable, housed additional guest rooms, the children's quarters when Edward's adult children visited, though his relationship with them was reportedly strained after his remarriage, the children viewing Eva as an interloper and fortune hunter, their father as a fool in his dotage, and at the far end of the wing, in deliberately less accessible spaces, the senior household staff, the housekeeper, the head butler, the chef, and Eva's personal maid. Privileges of rank within the servant hierarchy that nonetheless still marked them as fundamentally separate from the family, confined to their designated spaces, expected to use the back stairs and service corridors, visible in the public rooms only when performing their duties, otherwise as invisible as ghosts haunting the house they maintained. For Whitemarsh Hall, despite all its European affectation, was fundamentally an American machine, a corporation organized around the single purpose of manufacturing and maintaining a specific lifestyle, and like any corporation, it required a vast, hierarchical workforce operating in strict discipline, and here the true darkness of the Whitemarsh story begins to reveal itself. For the house required a permanent staff of approximately 60 people during the season when the Stotesburys were in residence, increasing to over 100 for major parties, a small army of servants whose labor was absolutely essential but whose humanity was systematically denied, their lives circumscribed by rigid rules and brutal work schedules that modern labor law would consider unconscionable, yet which in the 1920s were simply standard practice in great houses, the price servants paid for steady employment, room and board, and the dubious privilege of proximity to wealth. The servant hierarchy at Whitemarsh was itself a complex social system, with the butler at the apex of the male staff and the housekeeper reigning over the female servants, below them the footmen, valets, and under-butlers on the male side, and the ladies' maids, parlor maids, and chamber maids on the female side, then the kitchen brigade under the chef, assistant cooks, scullery maids, and vegetable preparers, and below them all, the unseen workers who literally kept the palace functioning, the boiler men who shoveled coal through the night, the groundskeepers and gardeners who maintained the 300 acres regardless of weather, the laundry workers who washed mountains of linens in basement washtubs before the installation of commercial laundry equipment, the night watchmen who patrolled the grounds, the maintenance men who repaired and painted and fixed whatever broke in a house so large that something was always breaking. These workers were predominantly immigrants or children of immigrants, Irish, Italian, Polish, German, with the black workers relegated to the most menial and invisible positions, the coal heavers, the scullery workers, the ground crews, paid less than their white counterparts for the same work, housed in separate quarters, subject to additional rules and scrutiny, their employment always more precarious, more easily terminated without cause or explanation, for in the 1920s American racial hierarchy, even poor white immigrants could look down on someone, could feel superior to someone, a calculated system that prevented working-class solidarity by ensuring workers competed with each other rather than uniting against their employers. The servant workday at White Marsh typically began at 5:30 or 6 a.m. and didn't end until after the family retired for the evening, often 10 or 11 p.m., with only brief breaks for meals eaten in the servant dining hall, a 6-day work week being standard, with Sunday afternoons off if duties permitted, and the pay was modest even by 1920 standards. A footman might earn $50 to $70 per month plus room and board, a housemaid $30 to $40, a scullery worker perhaps $20, though the senior staff like the butler and chef commanded considerably more, sometimes $150 to $200 monthly, enough to send money home to family or even save a modest sum, but always with the understanding that employment was at will, that a servant could be dismissed for any perceived infraction, for rudeness, for theft, for moral turpitude, which could mean anything from actual dishonesty to being seen in town with a boyfriend. And that references from previous employers were essential for finding new positions, creating a system where servants had every incentive to tolerate abuse, overwork, and indignity rather than risk their livelihoods and reputations by complaining. The physical layout of White Marsh itself enforced this separation and invisibility, for Horace Trumbauer had designed the house with an elaborate system of service corridors, back stairs, and hidden passages that allowed servants to move through the building without ever crossing the paths of the family or their guests except when actually performing service, an architectural embodiment of the Victorian ideal that servants should be seen but not heard, or better yet, not seen at all except when their hands were placing food on the table or their backs were turned while scrubbing a floor, the human beings themselves erased from consciousness, reduced to their functions, dehumanized by design. The basement level, where most servants spent their days when not working in the upstairs rooms, was a labyrinth of kitchens, pantries, storage rooms, workrooms, servant dining halls, and dormitory-style sleeping quarters for junior staff, lit by small windows set high in the walls, the ceilings lower, the finishes plain plaster and painted concrete rather than silk damask and marble, the temperature poorly regulated, sweltering in summer, drafty in winter, the noise of machinery constant, the whole environment a stark reminder that this was not the jewel box above but rather the factory that produced it, and the psychological impact of this daily transition, emerging from the grey utilitarian basement into the glittering palace above, transforming oneself into a silent, efficient servant, then descending again at day's end back into the basement realm, must have been profound. A daily reminder of one's place in the social order, of the unbridgeable gulf between the served and the serving. Yet for all this exploitation, many servants stayed at White Marsh for years, some for their entire careers, because despite the harsh conditions, employment at a premier estate like White Marsh carried prestige within the servant community, because the Stotesburys, whatever their faults, paid regularly and on time and provided decent food and lodging, and because in the uncertain economy of the 1920s, a secure position with a wealthy family offered more stability than most working-class jobs. And so servants endured, adapted, and in some cases even developed a peculiar pride in their association with the great house, identifying themselves as White Marsh staff, as if they were members of an exclusive club, though the exclusivity was their own exclusion from everything the house represented, a psychological adaptation that perhaps made exploitation bearable by reframing it as participation in something grand, even if one's only role was to scrub its floors or empty its chamber pots. Eva Stotesbury, for her part, seems to have viewed her servants with a mixture of genuine, if patronizing, concern and ruthless efficiency, maintaining the Victorian ideal of the benevolent mistress who knew all her servants' names, occasionally inquired about their families, and distributed Christmas bonuses, but who also maintained absolute discipline, demanded perfection, and did not hesitate to dismiss anyone who failed to meet her exacting standards, for Eva understood that White Marsh's success as a stage for social performance depended entirely on flawless execution, that a single substandard meal, a slightly wilted floral arrangement, a fingerprint on a silver tray could undermine the entire carefully constructed illusion of effortless aristocratic grace, and so she conducted daily inspections, checked the work of her housekeeper and butler constantly, maintained meticulous schedules and checklists, and cultivated a network of employment agencies and personal references that allowed her to find replacements quickly when needed, running Whitemarsh less like a home and more like a luxury hotel, which in some sense it was, except that the primary guests were the owners themselves, and the performance was never allowed to end, the show running continuously whenever they were in residence, which for much of the 1920s was several months per year, during which time Whitemarsh became one of the most important social centers on the East Coast, the site of spectacular weekend parties, formal dinners for 50 or 60 guests, charity events for Eva's various philanthropic causes. She was particularly devoted to animal welfare and supported several hospitals, and occasionally, the setting for more serious business, for Edward Stotesbury, despite his advanced age, remained deeply involved in finance. And Whitemarsh's masculine library and smoking rooms provided appropriate venues for discreet conversations with fellow bankers and industrialists, deals brokered over brandy and cigars while their wives discussed fashion and gossip in the drawing rooms, the whole house functioning as an instrument of power, a tool for cementing business relationships, for demonstrating creditworthiness through conspicuous consumption, for announcing that Edward T. Stotesbury was not some minor player but a titan of American capitalism whose wife entertained European royalty and whose art collection rivaled those of museums. But who actually attended these legendary parties, and what did they think of their hosts? Contemporary accounts reveal a complicated picture, for while many guests praised Eva's taste and Edward's hospitality, and while invitations to Whitemarsh were certainly coveted among social climbers and nouveau riche industrialists, Philadelphia's oldest families, the Biddles, Cadwalladers, and Ingersolls who traced their lineage to colonial times, reportedly maintained a certain cool distance, attending when protocol required but never fully accepting the Stotesburys as equals, and their private correspondence reveals dismissive references to Eva's vulgar display and Edward's desperate striving, suggesting that for all their expenditure, for all the European furniture and aristocratic pretension, the Stotesburys never quite achieved the social acceptance they craved, never quite erased the taint of being new money, of having earned rather than inherited their fortune, of being, in the cruelest assessment, merely rich rather than genuinely aristocratic. This must have stung Eva particularly, for she had invested not just money but years of effort into cultivating the perfect taste, studying European court protocol, learning the nuances of aristocratic entertaining, yet still found herself on the outside looking in, welcomed for her wealth and her hospitality but not her pedigree, and one wonders whether, in her private moments, she ever questioned the entire enterprise, ever felt the futility of trying to buy centuries of heritage with even unlimited millions, or whether her pride and ambition were too strong to admit such doubts, whether she simply pushed harder, spent more lavishly, cultivated ever more impressive guest lists, trapped in an escalating arms race of social display that could never end in victory because the rules were designed to ensure that people like her could never truly win. Edward, for his part, seems to have been more philosophical, or perhaps simply less invested in the social dimensions of Whitemarsh, content to have created a beautiful home for his beautiful wife, to enjoy his art collection and his gardens, to smoke his cigars in his library, and to leave the social warfare to Eva, though he must have been aware of the whispers, the condescension, the fact that many viewed him as a foolish old man dominated by a younger woman who was spending his fortune on her own vanity projects, a narrative that was both unfair. Eva was far more than a trophy wife, possessing genuine aesthetic sensibility and formidable organizational skills, and partially true, for Edward's wealth did finance Eva's ambitions, and as he aged into his 70s and then 80s, he became less involved in business, more content to play the country gentleman, to host but not dominate parties, to allow Eva to orchestrate while he observed, a willing participant in her theater. Perhaps because the alternative was acknowledging that his entire second marriage had been a mistake, that his children's suspicions had been correct, that he had traded his dignified widowhood for a tumultuous old age in the service of someone else's dream. The stock market crash of October 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression should have shattered the Whitemarsh illusion immediately, for Edward Stotesbury's fortune, vast as it was, depended on the continued success of American capitalism, on the stock and bond markets, on corporate dividends and real estate values, and when those markets collapsed spectacularly, When banks failed and corporations went bankrupt and the entire financial system seemed on the verge of disintegration, the plutocrats of the 1920s suddenly found their paper wealth evaporating, their gilt-edged securities becoming worthless, their supposedly unshakable positions revealed as dangerously leveraged, yet somehow, remarkably, disastrously, the Stotesburys continued as before, maintaining Whitemarsh in full operation, still entertaining though on a somewhat reduced scale, still employing dozens of servants even as unemployment reached 25% and breadlines stretched around city blocks, and this decision, to continue the performance even as the world burned, may have been the greatest mistake of Edward's life, the moment when Whitemarsh transformed from a symbol of success into a symbol of obscene indifference, of callous disregard for the suffering surrounding them, of a ruling class so divorced from reality that they literally could not conceive of altering their lifestyle even as millions lost everything. The public mood was turning sharply against the wealthy, with newspaper editorials condemning the excesses of the 1920s, with politicians like Franklin Roosevelt campaigning on platforms of economic justice and progressive taxation, with labor unions growing more militant and socialist ideas finding broader audiences, and in this environment, maintaining a 147-room palace with 60 servants was not just expensive but politically tone-deaf, an invitation for criticism, investigation, and eventual retribution, yet Edward and Eva seemed oblivious, or perhaps fatalistic, accepting that their world was ending but determined to go down in style, to maintain the standards they had established regardless of cost or consequence, a kind of defiant nihilism disguised as aristocratic dignity. The financial reality, however, was increasingly grim, for even Edward's massive fortune could not indefinitely sustain the hemorrhaging of cash that Whitemarsh required, the house consuming an estimated $300,000 to $500,000 annually in operating expenses, the modern equivalent of perhaps $5 to $8 million, covering staff salaries, maintenance, utilities, food, and the constant acquisitions of art and furnishings that Eva deemed essential, and while Edward's income had been more than sufficient to cover these costs in the 1920s, the Depression slashed dividend payments, devalued real estate holdings, and made many of his investments illiquid, unable to be sold without massive losses, and so he began, quietly and with great reluctance, to liquidate assets, selling off securities at depressed prices, borrowing against his remaining holdings, economizing where possible but refusing to undertake the only economy that would have truly mattered, closing Whitemarsh, dismissing the staff, and retreating to a more modest existence appropriate to his reduced circumstances. Why this refusal? Pride, certainly, and perhaps love for Eva, unwillingness to admit failure or to force his wife to abandon her life's work, but also possibly a kind of generational blindness, an inability to accept that the rules had changed, that the Gilded Age was truly over, that the massive fortunes accumulated by men like him would be subject to new forms of taxation and regulation, that the political consensus that had protected plutocratic privilege for 50 years was crumbling, replaced by a New Deal coalition that viewed concentrated wealth not as a mark of virtue but as a social pathology requiring correction. Edward Townsend Stotesbury died in May 1938, at age 88, having outlived his fortune, his health, and his era, and while the obituaries praised his banking career and his philanthropy, he had donated millions to hospitals, universities, and cultural institutions over his lifetime. They also noted, with varying degrees of tact, the Whitemarsh extravagance, the Eva Stotesbury legendarily lavish parties, the sense that here was a man who had been, in the end, more symbol than substance, more show than character, a representative of an age that history would judge harshly, and whatever Edward's own thoughts in his final years, whether he felt satisfaction at what he had built, or regret, or simply weary acceptance, he took them to his grave, leaving Eva alone at Whitemarsh, a 68-year-old widow facing a problem that would have daunted a woman half her age: how to maintain an unmaintainable palace with a fortune that no longer existed. Eva Stotesbury's situation in 1938 was simultaneously tragic and absurd, for while she was not poor by any ordinary standard, Edward's estate, even after Depression losses, was still worth several $1 million. She was utterly unprepared for life without the cash flow that had sustained Whitemarsh, unprepared to economize, to dismiss staff, to abandon the social position she had spent 25 years constructing, and so she attempted to continue as before, drawing down capital, selling off Investments and art pieces, borrowing, desperately trying to maintain the illusion that nothing had changed, that the Depression was merely a temporary setback, that the White Marsh era could be extended indefinitely if she just held on long enough, a strategy that was doomed from the outset but which she pursued with the same fierce determination she had once applied to conquering Philadelphia society, refusing to admit defeat, refusing to be pitted, refusing to acknowledge that the world had moved on and that great private palaces like Whitemarsh were now anachronisms, hangovers from a discredited age, socially unacceptable in a democracy struggling with mass unemployment and economic dislocation. The servants, who had once numbered 60 in season, were gradually reduced, first through attrition, retirements and departures not replaced, and then through actual layoffs, painful dismissals where long-serving staff were given modest severance and turned out into a depression economy where jobs were nearly impossible to find, and one wonders about the human cost of these decisions, the fear and anger and desperation of workers who had given years of their lives to Whitemarsh, who had tolerated poor conditions and low pay because the position was secure, only to find themselves discarded when convenience required, their loyalty rewarded with pink slips and empty promises of references, cast into an economic void while Eva continued to live in 147 rooms, continued to maintain a reduced but still substantial household, continued to insist on standards that the circumstances no longer supported. The maintenance of the house itself began to slip, with repairs deferred, paintwork left unrefreshed, mechanical systems aging without replacement, the gardens growing slightly wild as the groundskeeper staff was cut, small signs of neglect that would have been unthinkable in the 1920s but which now accumulated season by season, the house beginning its slow decline from perfection toward decrepitude, though it would take years for the deterioration to become obvious to outsiders, for a building as well constructed as Whitemarsh had reserves of grandeur that could sustain considerable neglect before failing completely. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 brought new challenges and finally forced Eva to confront reality, for wartime rationing, price controls, and labor shortages made maintaining Whitemarsh nearly impossible even for those with money, and many of her remaining servants left for better-paying war industry jobs, for military service, or simply because they were tired of the increasingly desperate atmosphere of a house whose era had clearly ended, and Eva, now 70 years old and in declining health, finally accepted that she could not continue, could not single-handedly sustain an institution that required dozens of workers and unlimited resources, and so in 1942, she did what once would have been unthinkable, she offered Whitemarsh to the United States government for use as a military hospital or convalescent facility, a gift that would at least preserve the building and provide some patriotic cover for her surrender, a way to frame defeat as noble sacrifice rather than abject failure. The government, however, declined, judging that Whitemarsh's layout, designed for entertaining, not medical care, was unsuitable for hospital use, and that the cost of adapting and operating it would exceed the value of the donation, a rejection that must have been crushing for Eva, a final confirmation that Whitemarsh had no value beyond its original narrow purpose, that it could not be repurposed or adapted, that it was, fundamentally, useless, a beautiful useless monument to a dead age. She attempted to sell it, listing the property with brokers, offering it at steadily decreasing prices, from an initial asking price of $1 million, already a massive loss from the $6 million invested in construction and furnishing, down to $500,000, then $300,000, finding no buyers in a wartime economy where private palaces were unsaleable white elephants, where potential purchasers could easily calculate that even at a bargain price, the ongoing operating costs would bankrupt anyone without a depression-proof fortune, and where, increasingly, such displays of wealth were seen as morally suspect, as evidence of the social failures that had led to economic collapse and global war. Eva Stotesbury died in April 1946, aged 76, her death receiving surprisingly little press attention given her former prominence, as if the world had already forgotten her, already moved on to new celebrities and new scandals, and she died in her Palm Beach mansion, not at Whitemarsh, reportedly having not visited the Pennsylvania estate in nearly 2 years, unable or unwilling to face the decay of her greatest achievement, the monument that had consumed so much of her life, her money, her ambition, and her identity, preferring to remember it as it had been in the golden 1920s rather than confront what it had become. Whitemarsh Hall stood empty after Eva's death, abandoned by the heirs who wanted nothing to do with it, who viewed it as an albatross, a massive liability that consumed money for taxes, insurance, and minimal maintenance while generating no income and having no conceivable use, and for nearly a decade the great house mouldered, vandals broke windows and stripped copper pipes and brass fixtures, the roof began to leak, water damage spread through the upper floors, the gardens reverted to wilderness, and the whole estate took on a haunted, Gothic quality, a monument to hubris and waste, locals bringing their children to peer through the broken windows at the ruined grandeur within, at the ballroom floor buckled by water damage, at the grand staircase's marble cracked and stained, at the library shelves empty of their books, the furniture and art and everything movable having been removed by the estate and sold at auction for a fraction of their acquisition cost, the house reduced to its bones, to its architecture and fixtures, and even those were rapidly deteriorating, for a building as complex as Whitemarsh required constant care, and without heat in winter, without repairs to the roof, without anyone to pump out basement flooding or patch broken windows, nature and entropy were rapidly reclaiming the palace, rendering it not just empty but ruined, not just vacant but fundamentally compromised, damaged beyond any reasonable possibility of restoration. In 1948, the Stotesbury heirs finally found a buyer, not for the house, which was by now generally understood to be worthless except for salvage, but for the land, the 300 acres of increasingly valuable suburban real estate that could be subdivided into dozens of building lots for the post-war housing boom, and the buyer, a developer named Matthew H. McCloskey, paid approximately $100,000 for the entire property, a figure so absurdly low compared to the original investment that it would be darkly comic were it not so tragic, and McCloskey's intentions were clear from the outset: demolish the house, strip anything of salvage value, subdivide the land, build middle-class suburban homes, and profit from the transformation of Stotesbury's aristocratic fantasy into democratic reality, from one 147-room palace into 63-bedroom houses for returning veterans and their families. A poetic inversion that the Depression-era social reformers would have applauded, the literal destruction of plutocratic excess to make way for middle-class domesticity, the American dream replacing the American delusion. The demolition of Whitemarsh Hall began in 1948 and took nearly 2 years to complete, for a building of such massive construction did not yield easily to wrecking crews, its Indiana limestone walls 3 feet thick in places, its steel structural framework engineered to last centuries, its foundations dug deep into Pennsylvania bedrock, and so demolition required not just wrecking balls but also explosives, carefully placed charges that brought down sections of wall in controlled collapses, creating clouds of dust visible for miles, audible booms that rattled windows in nearby towns, drawing crowds of spectators who came to watch the destruction, some former servants among them, some neighbors who had resented the Stotesbury display, some simply curious locals who wanted to witness the end of an era, and the scene had an almost apocalyptic quality, this palace that had seemed so permanent, so solid, so eternal in its limestone grandeur, reduced to rubble in a series of explosions. The dust settling to reveal empty space where rooms had been, where people had lived and worked and entertained and suffered, all of it erased as if it had never existed, and what the explosives didn't destroy, the salvage crews dismantled, removing marble mantelpieces, carved wooden paneling, bronze doors, light fixtures, ironwork, anything that could be sold to architectural salvage dealers, who in turn sold these fragments to other wealthy homeowners, to decorators, to museums, so that pieces of Whitemarsh are scattered across the country today, a mantelpiece in a Connecticut estate, a crystal chandelier in a Texas mansion, carved doors in a California villa, fragments divorced from their context, their origins often forgotten, ornaments stripped of meaning, beautiful objects that once formed part of a coherent whole but which now exist only as isolated artifacts, ghosts of a demolished palace. The limestone itself was crushed and used as fill, the structural steel sold for scrap at the wartime premium prices that made demolition almost profitable, the lead pipes and copper wire salvaged for their metal value, the grounds bulldozed flat and surveyed for subdivision, and by 1950, it was essentially finished. Whitemarsh Hall was gone, erased so thoroughly that someone unfamiliar with the history, standing on the site, would never guess that a palatial estate had existed there, would see Only suburban streets and ranch houses and driveways and lawns, the landscape of post-war American normalcy, democratic and prosperous and fundamentally opposed to everything White Marsh had represented. Why was White Marsh demolished when so many other Gilded Age estates survived, when the Vanderbilt mansions in Newport became museums, when Henry Clay Frick's New York residence became a celebrated art gallery, when countless European-style palaces were adapted as schools, hotels, corporate headquarters, or event venues? The answer reveals the darkest truth of the White Marsh story, the final judgment on Edward and Eva's dream. White Marsh was demolished because nobody wanted it, because it had no value beyond its original purpose, because it was too large to be practical, too expensive to operate, too outdated in its social assumptions, too compromised by its history, and too thoroughly associated with a discredited era to be worth preserving, even for free. Unlike the Vanderbilt estates, which had architectural distinction and historical significance tied to prominent family names, White Marsh was designed by a competent but not groundbreaking architect in a derivative style that mimicked European models without adding anything original, a skillful copy but not a masterpiece. Unlike Frick's mansion, White Marsh's art collection had been dispersed, sold off by Eva during her desperate final years and then by the estate after her death, leaving an empty shell without the cultural content that might have justified museum use. Unlike estates that found institutional buyers, universities, religious organizations, foundations, White Marsh had no natural constituency, no alumni loyalty, no denominational support, no philanthropic mission to inherit it. The Stotesburys, for all their wealth, had not founded universities or endowed hospitals that might have accepted the estate as a campus, had not created lasting institutions that could have perpetuated their legacy, had spent their fortune on consumption rather than creation, on display rather than endowment, and so when they died, their monument died with them, having no roots deeper than their own lives, no meaning beyond their own ambitions. The demolition of White Marsh was not an accident or a tragedy in any cosmic sense, it was the inevitable consequence of building a house whose only purpose was to impress, whose only function was to demonstrate wealth, whose only meaning was bound up in a specific social competition that ended when the competitors died or went bankrupt, leaving behind a structure as hollow and purposeless as a theater set, magnificent from the right angle and properly lit, but revealed as fakery when examined closely or viewed from behind. What lessons does the White Marsh story offer? What dark truths does it reveal about American wealth and ambition, about the costs of inequality and the moral bankruptcy of Gilded Age values? First and most obviously, it demonstrates the fundamental instability of fortunes based purely on financial manipulation rather than productive enterprise, for Edward Stotesbury's wealth came not from building factories or inventing technologies or creating products, but from arranging deals, consolidating companies, speculating in securities, the paper shuffling that created immense personal fortunes while contributing questionable social value, and such fortunes proved remarkably vulnerable when the underlying system collapsed, when the stock market crashed and the banks failed and the whole financial edifice revealed itself as substantially illusion, built on confidence and credit and the assumption of endless growth, assumptions that 1929 shattered definitively. Second, White Marsh illustrates the futility of using wealth to purchase social acceptance across class boundaries, for despite spending millions and decades of effort, the Stotesburys never achieved the unqualified acceptance they craved from old Philadelphia society, never erased the stain of being new money, never transformed themselves into true aristocrats no matter how many French antiques they acquired or how many titled Europeans they entertained, because aristocracy, whatever its faults, is fundamentally about inherited position, about lineage and heritage and centuries of accumulated privilege, things that by definition cannot be purchased by a single generation of strivers, and American society, for all its democratic rhetoric, has always maintained informal mechanisms for preserving status hierarchies, for ensuring that the truly wealthy old families remain distinct from the merely rich new ones, a particularly cruel form of snobbery that allows people to take pride in advantages they did nothing to earn while despising those whose wealth at least represents some form of achievement, however morally compromised. Third, and perhaps most significantly, the White Marsh story exposes the massive human cost of maintaining such establishments, the armies of invisible workers whose labor sustained the illusion of effortless grandeur, who spent their lives in service to someone else's vanity project, who were paid poorly and worked brutally long hours and had their humanity systematically denied by architectural design and social convention, who were dismissed without compunction when financial pressure required economies, and whose names and stories are almost entirely lost to history, except in the dry records of household accounts and employment ledgers, numbers on a page, expenses to be minimized, functions rather than people. How many lives were constrained, how much human potential was wasted, how much dignity was sacrificed so that Eva Stotesbury could entertain in perfect Louis XVI settings, so that Edward could pose as a country gentleman, so that wealthy guests could spend a weekend pretending to be European nobility. The question is unanswerable in any precise way, but the moral weight is undeniable. Whitemarsh, like all such estates, was built on exploitation, on a system that treated working-class people as instruments, as means to plutocratic ends, as factors of production to be managed rather than as human beings with rights, dignity, and aspirations equal to those of their employers. And while the Stotesburys were probably no worse than most plutocrats of their era, no more cruel or indifferent than their peers, that merely indicts the entire system, the whole Gilded Age social order that normalized such relationships, that made them seem natural and inevitable rather than chosen and constructed and fundamentally unjust. Fourth, Whitemarsh demonstrates the environmental costs of such concentrated wealth, the 300 acres removed from agricultural productivity or natural ecosystem function to serve as one family's private pleasure ground, the forests cleared and reshaped into formal gardens, the water diverted for irrigation and ornamental fountains, the energy consumed. Think of the tons of coal burned annually to heat 147 rooms, the electricity generated, the resources expended on maintenance and operations, all for the benefit of two people and their guests, a level of per capita resource consumption so grotesquely disproportionate that it would be considered criminal by any reasonable standard of environmental ethics, yet which in the 1920s was simply accepted as the prerogative of wealth, the successful claiming the right to consume the planet's resources in whatever quantities their bank accounts permitted, without regard for sustainability, equity, or the rights of future generations. The Gilded Age plutocrats were not thinking about carbon footprints or ecological sustainability, those concepts didn't exist in their intellectual framework, but their actions nonetheless had environmental consequences, the cumulative impact of thousands of such estates, millions of such decisions, a pattern of rapacious consumption that we are still living with, still paying for, still trying to reverse or at least stabilize before it destroys the ecological systems that support civilization itself. Fifth, the Whitemarsh saga reveals the psychological costs of such wealth, the ways it deformed the lives even of its supposed beneficiaries. For what kind of life did Edward Stotesbury actually have in his final decades, married to a woman half his age whose ambitions drove him to expenditures that ultimately consumed his fortune, increasingly alienated from his children, spending months of every year maintaining multiple enormous houses that he barely inhabited, surrounded by servants but profoundly alone, his final years shadowed by financial anxiety and the knowledge that his great project was failing, that the social acceptance he and Eva craved was never going to materialize, that he had traded his comfortable widowhood and respected position for a gamble that hadn't paid off. And Eva, for all her beauty and taste and determination, what did she actually achieve beyond the creation of an enormous house that stood for barely 2 decades before being abandoned and demolished, beyond a social position that evaporated at her death, beyond a reputation that history would judge as more pathetic than admirable, the ambitious woman who overreached, who spent her husband's fortune chasing an impossible dream, who died having lost everything she built, her life's work literally erased from the landscape within a few years of her death. There is something profoundly tragic in their story, not tragic in the classical sense of noble figures brought low by fate or fatal flaws, but tragic in the modern sense of wasted potential, of human lives consumed by empty pursuits, of people who had every material advantage yet somehow ended up with nothing of lasting value, no children who loved them, no institutions that bore their names, no legacy beyond a few photographs and the scattered architectural fragments of a demolished palace. Their names remembered primarily as cautionary tales, as examples of how not to live, of what not to value, of the emptiness at the heart of pure materialism. The site of Whitemarsh Hall today is a suburban neighborhood called Whitemarsh Valley, the name itself a kind of ghost, a faint echo of what once stood there, and the streets are lined with comfortable middle-class homes built in the 1950s and 60s, ranch houses and split levels with small yards, each housing a family, children playing on lawns, cars in driveways, the mundane, cluttered, utterly normal landscape of American suburban life, and there is no marker, no plaque, no indication that this neighborhood was once a single estate, that Edward and Eva Stotesbury once commanded this entire landscape, that armies of servants once labored here to maintain an impossible standard of perfection, that some of the greatest social dramas of the Gilded Age played out in rooms that no longer exist, and perhaps that erasure is appropriate, perhaps it is just, perhaps the demolition of White Marsh and its replacement with dozens of ordinary homes represents a kind of democratic victory, the aristocratic pretensions of the Gilded Age quite literally bulldozed to make way for the middle-class prosperity of post-war America, one family's palace transformed into 60 families' homes, a mathematical proof that democratic distribution of resources serves more people, creates more human flourishing, than concentrated wealth ever could, no matter how tastefully displayed. Yet there is also something disturbing in the completeness of the erasure, in the fact that whole building, that entire world, could simply vanish, could be wiped from existence so thoroughly that its very location is now disputed, with only a handful of elderly residents still able to point approximately to where the house stood, the gardens ran, the main drive curved, and even those memories are fading as the last generation who remembers White Marsh firsthand passes away, leaving only photographs, architectural plans in archives, scattered newspaper accounts, and the occasional salvaged artifact to prove it ever existed at all. What would Edward Stotesbury think if he could see the site today, see his 300-acre estate subdivided into building lots, his marble halls replaced by ranch houses, his formal gardens now backyard swing sets and above-ground pools, his entrance drive now a street called Stotesbury Lane, the name reduced to a suburban address, drained of grandeur? Would he feel vindicated that at least some memory persists, or horrified at the transformation, at the democratization of his private domain? And Eva, who invested so much of herself in White Marsh, who saw it as her masterpiece, her claim to immortality, who believed she was creating something that would last for centuries and become an American cultural landmark, what would she think of its demolition, of its replacement with subdivisions, of the fact that her entire life's work survived less than 30 years before being erased, that she is remembered, when remembered at all, not as a tastemaker or cultural figure but as a symbol of Gilded Age excess, of wasteful consumption, of misplaced priorities? The questions are unanswerable, the dead having no opinions on present circumstances, but they haunt the site nonetheless, ghostly presences lingering over a landscape that has forgotten them, and perhaps that forgetting is the final, darkest truth of the White Marsh story, that even immense wealth, even architectural grandeur, even the most determined efforts to build a lasting legacy are ultimately powerless against time and social change, that what one generation builds in certainty of its permanence, the next may demolish without regret, that nothing, no fortune, no palace, no carefully cultivated social position, is truly secure, truly permanent, truly beyond the reach of historical judgment and material decay, and that the only legacies that endure are those built on something more substantial than stone and mortar, more meaningful than social display, more valuable than the temporary admiration of one's peers, legacies of ideas, institutions, human relationships, and moral choices that ripple forward through time independent of physical monuments, legacies that the Stotesburys, for all their wealth and ambition, somehow failed to create, leaving behind only the dark story of Whitemarsh Hall, a 147-room warning about the seductive dangers of confusing wealth with worth, display with achievement, and possessions with meaning, a warning that each new generation of strivers seems determined to ignore, rebuilding in new forms the same hollow palaces, pursuing the same empty social competitions, making the same tragic mistakes, as if we cannot help but repeat the patterns that history has already judged and found wanting, as if the dark truths revealed by Whitemarsh's demolition are too painful to fully accept, too threatening to our own ambitions and desires, and so we look away, we forget, we allow the story to fade into obscurity, until the next palace falls, the next fortune evaporates, the next generation of wasted lives and demolished dreams forces us to confront once again the question we prefer to avoid: what, in the end, are we building, and for whom, and why, and at what cost to ourselves and others, and will any of it matter when our own time comes to pass into history, to be judged, to be remembered or forgotten, to become ourselves a cautionary tale whispered over the ruins